Welcome to Horrified Stories, where fear comes to life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-chilling tales. Let's start our today's story. Ashes in the Wind. It had been years since Sarah had returned to the town where she grew up. Life had taken her far away, chasing opportunities, new beginnings, and the promise of freedom from the suffocating small town where she once lived. But when her mother passed, Sarah found herself back at the house, on the hill's old family home. The house that now felt foreign, abandoned in both spirit and structure. The town itself had changed, but the house remained eerily the same. Time seemed to have forgotten it. The walls sagged with memories, the once polished floors now creaky and warped from years of neglect. There was a heaviness in the air, an oppressive silence that hung over the property like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Sarah had inherited the house after her mother's death, and now, with a mixture of dread and obligation, she had returned to settle affairs. Her first few days back were spent sorting through old belongings, finding dust-covered boxes of forgotten family heirlooms and photographs. The house, though seemingly abandoned, had never really felt empty. There was something always there, a feeling, a presence just out of sight. Sarah chalked it up to her overactive imagination, a result of her grief and exhaustion. After all, what was there to fear in a house she had once called home? But as the days wore on, things began to change. Small things, subtle at first, faint noises at night, the sound of footsteps in the hall when no one was there, the flicker of lights that shouldn't have been able to flicker. Sarah would brush it off as the house settling, or perhaps the wind against the windows. After all, houses do have their quirks, especially old ones. It wasn't until she opened the attic door that things took a darker turn. The attic had always been off limits when she was a child, a place full of old furniture, forgotten memories, and the smell of dust and mildew. But when Sarah climbed the narrow stairs one afternoon, she was unprepared for what she would find. The attic, while musty and neglected, seemed almost untouched. There, on a dusty old wooden table, lay a small, blackened box. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an old keepsake. But once Sarah touched it, something cold and sharp ran up her spine. She hadn't meant to open it, but her fingers were drawn to it, as if the box were calling to her. She hesitated, but curiosity won. As she lifted the lid, a rush of air seemed to escape, as if the box had been holding something in for a long time. Inside, there was a handful of ashes, blackened, brittle, and crumbling. The ashes were a fine powder, almost like charcoal dust, but it wasn't the ashes themselves that caused Sarah's pulse to quicken. It was the faint, almost imperceptible whisper she heard the moment she touched the box. The voice was so quiet that she could barely hear it, like a distant murmur carried on the wind. "It's time." Her heart skipped. She quickly closed the box, setting it back on the table as if it had burned her. The silence that followed was deafening. The whispering stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't. As Sarah made her way down the stairs, she could swear she saw something in the corner of her eye, a fleeting figure standing at the end of the hallway, just out of reach. When she turned, nothing was there, but the cold chill that swept through her made her shiver. She forced herself to dismiss it as a trick of the mind. She was tired, alone in an unfamiliar place, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't quite as empty as it seemed. That night, as Sarah lay in the bed her parents once slept in, she tried to sleep. The bed felt wrong beneath her, like it was still holding the weight of years of memories. Sleep wouldn't come. She tossed and turned, listening to the house creak and groan under the weight of the past. Then, just as she was drifting off, she heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. It was the same voice, soft and low, like a lullaby sung through the cracks of time. "It's time. Come to me." Sarah's breath hitched, her skin prickling with terror. She sat her day up, heart pounding in her chest. The voice was so clear, so real, that it felt as if it were right next to her. She turned on the bedside lamp, her hands trembling, but there was nothing in the room but shadows. The voice had come from the walls. That much was certain. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. It was something or someone calling to her. Unable to sleep, Sarah got up and paced around the room, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. She went downstairs, but the kitchen was silent. The house felt still, but the air seemed thicker than before, as though something heavy was hanging over it. That was when she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. The box from the attic, the one she had left upstairs on the table, was now sitting on the kitchen counter. She frowned. Had she moved it? She was sure she hadn't. She hadn't gone near it since she had closed it in the attic. And yet, there it was, sitting innocently as though it had never been touched. The whispers came again, louder this time, from somewhere just beyond the walls. "Come to me. Open it. You must open it." Sarah felt a cold, sinking feeling in her stomach. The box wasn't just a keepsake. It wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a part of something darker, something older. As the whispers grew louder, Sarah knew one thing for certain. Whatever was in the box, whatever it represented, was not going to let her leave without it. The next day, Sarah tried to go about her routine, pushing the events of the night before to the back of her mind. But something had changed. The house was no longer just a home. It felt like a prison. The air was thick, and the silence was suffocating. As the sun began to set, she found herself standing at the kitchen counter, staring at the box once again. She reached for it, her fingers brushing the lid before she could stop herself. The whisper started again. It's time to remember." Against her better judgment, Sarah opened the box again, but this time, the ashes inside weren't the same. They seemed to shimmer with an unnatural glow, like embers from a long-dead fire. She could hear the whispers growing louder, closer, until it was as though the voice was right next to her ear. "You can never leave. You belong to me." The air around her grew cold, the temperature plummeting so suddenly that her breath turned to fog in front of her face. Sarah recoiled, slamming the box shut. The whispers faded, but the presence in the room didn't. It was watching her, waiting. As she set the box down, she noticed something on the floor, something small and strange. A blackened ash, no bigger than a pebble, lay at her feet. But when Sarah looked up again, she saw something far worse. In the corner of the room, just by the window, stood a figure, a dark silhouette, tall and thin, watching her. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, shrouded in shadow. For the first time since she'd returned, Sarah was paralyzed with fear. This wasn't a trick of the light. This wasn't exhaustion or her mind playing tricks. Whatever this thing was, it was real. It was here, and it had been waiting for her. She backed away slowly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure didn't follow, but Sarah could feel its eyes on her, a heavy presence in the room. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and restless days. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The whispers didn't stop. They echoed in her mind, keeping her awake, tormenting her. Every room she entered felt colder, darker, and the box seemed to call to her, beckoning her to open it again. On the fourth night, Sarah found herself standing in front of the box once more. The whispers had become more insistent, louder, demanding. She couldn't resist anymore. She opened it. This time, the ashes weren't just ashes. As the lid lifted, she saw something else inside, something small, wrapped in what looked like ancient, brittle cloth. She reached for it, trembling, and as her fingers touched the fabric, the world seemed to shift. The ground beneath her feet buckled, and the walls of the house seemed to close in. Sarah's heart pounded as her fingers made contact with the fragile cloth inside the box. It was colder than she expected, its texture stiff and rough. As she pulled it free, a wave of cold swept through her body, causing her to shudder involuntarily. The moment she touched it, the whispers, those haunting, insistent whispers, grew louder, swirling around her in an almost tangible rush of sound. "It's time to remember." Her breath caught in her throat. She hesitated, staring at the bundle in her hands, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake by opening the box. But before she could second to guess herself, a cloth tore slightly, revealing what was inside. A small, weathered photograph. It was black and white, faded almost beyond recognition, but Sarah could still make out the faces. There were 5 people in the image: a young girl with dark, solemn eyes, an elderly woman whose features were partially obscured by shadows, a man with graying hair and a stern expression, and 2 others she didn't recognize. The 5th person, however, struck her with an unsettling chill. It was the face of a man she had never seen before at all, with hollow eyes, dark hair, and a faint smirk that seemed to mock her. Sarah turned the photograph over, her hands trembling. There was something written on the back, scrawled in a messy, hurried hand: "The price of memory is never paid in full." As she read the words, her skin prickled. It was like a warning, a warning she didn't understand, but fell deep in her bones. She dropped the photograph back into the box as if it had burned her. But the damage had already been done. The room around her seemed to contract, the air growing heavier, thicker with each passing moment. The whispers were no longer a distant murmur. They were now all around her, pressing against her ears. "You should never have opened it. The past is not meant to be remembered." Sarah dropped the box onto the table and backed away, her head spinning, Her pulse hammered in her ears, the chill in the air intensified, and she suddenly felt as though she were being suffocated by the very walls of the house. Without thinking, she rushed out of the kitchen and into the living room. The walls seemed to close in on her. The familiar surroundings of her childhood home now warped into something dark and oppressive. The house, once a place of comfort, now felt like a trap of prison. The whispering didn't stop. It followed her. As she paced frantically across the room, her eyes landed on the old, rusted fireplace. She remembered her mother sitting there, years ago, reading aloud as the fire crackled, the warmth of the flames, the way the house had always smelled of cinnamon and wood. But now, it was all different, dark and cold. The fireplace held something else now, too. A shadow. Sarah frowned. She didn't need to turn around to know that the figure was there. She could feel its presence behind her, hovering like a dark cloud. Slowly, she turned her head, her body trembling with terror. Standing in the doorway, just outside the living room, was the figure she had seen in the corner of the room the night before. The same tall, shadowy figure, the same hollow eyes, the same expressionless face. It was him, the man from the photograph. But he wasn't just a figure in the shadows. He was real. For a moment, Sarah couldn't move. The figure stood motionless, as though studying her, waiting. Then, without warning, the figure took a step forward, and another. Her breath hitched as she took a step back, heart pounding in her chest. But there was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to run. She was trapped in the house with a presence that had been lurking for far too long. It's too late to run now. The voice was low, a growl that sent chills down her spine. It was the same voice she uttered in the whispers, but now it was louder, more forceful, as though it had come from deep within the walls themselves. Sarah backed away until her heels bumped against the edge of the couch. Her mind raced. Had to escape. She had to get out. But the figure was getting closer. Each step was slow, deliberate, as though it enjoyed the fear that was radiating from her. The figure spoke again, its voice almost like a hiss. "You've opened it. Now you belong to me." And then it lunged. Sarah gasped, her body freezing in place. The figure's hand reached for her, long fingers that seemed to stretch out like tendrils of darkness. But just before it could make contact, the air around her seemed to shudder, and the figure halted, its hand lingering just inches from her face. A shrill, unearthly sound filled the room like the screeching of metal against metal, and the figure recoiled, its face contorted in pain. The dark form twisted and jerked, as if something was pulling it back, something stronger than its will. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and in an instant, the figure was gone. Sarah blinked, her heart still pounding in her chest. The living room was silent once more, the air still thick with tension. The shadows in the room had deepened, but there was no sign of the figure. She could hardly believe what had just happened. Was she losing her mind? Had the stress of the situation caused her to hallucinate? Or had something truly supernatural occurred? But the ashes, the box, the photograph, these things weren't imaginary. They had been real, and whatever force had haunted the house for so long was now drawing closer. Sarah could feel it in her bones. The house was alive with something ancient, something malevolent, and it had no intention of letting her go. She stumbled to the door and opened it, desperate for air, for space, for anything to clear the fog in her mind. Outside, the night was eerily still. No breeze stirred the trees. The world felt too quiet, too dead. The wind had died down, and the once thick scent of pine trees was now still, like something was decaying just beyond the horizon. That's when she saw it. At the foot of the hill, just past the old garden where her mother used to grow flowers, was a figure, a silhouette, standing motionless in the dark, staring back at her. She couldn't tell if it was the same figured man from the photo, the shadow in the house, but she knew one thing for sure: it was waiting for her to come closer. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't go back inside. Instead, Sarah took a deep breath and stepped out into the yard, her feet crunching on the dried grass. She couldn't explain why, but something inside her told her that whatever was waiting for her down the hill, whatever was calling to her, held the key to everything. With each step, the whispers grew louder again, swirling around her in the wind, and when she reached the bottom of the hill, she turned toward the figure, her voice shaking as she called out into the darkness, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" But the only answer was the whisper in her ear, the same words that had been haunting her for days. "The price of memory is never paid in full." The cold night air bit at Sarah's skin as she stood at the foot of the hill, her gaze locked on the distant figure standing in the shadows. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to run, to do anything other than stand there in the night, staring into the void, but her legs wouldn't move. The whispering that had filled the house, The voice that had plagued her thoughts for days had followed her outside. It curled around her like smoke, slipping into her ears, filling her mind with its insistent demands. Come closer. It's waiting for you. Sarah's breath came out in shallow, nervous gasps. She felt as though she were caught in a trance, unable to break free. The figure, standing motionless at the base of the hill, seemed to beckon her forward. Its features were still obscured in the darkness, but she could feel its presence in her bones. It was like nothing she had ever experienced, a sensation that both terrified and drew her in. She tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The whispers grew louder, more forceful, as if the wind itself had been carrying them from the house. Who are you? Sarah called out, her voice trembling in the still air. The figure did not answer. It simply stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for her to make the first move. A strange sense of dread flooded Sarah's chest, but something else knotted her to a compelling, magnetic pull that made her feet move before her mind could protest. She had to know what was happening. She had to understand why the house was so suffocating, why the whispers wouldn't let her go. Taking a tentative step forward, Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet shift, as though the earth itself were shifting with her. The whispers seemed to echo from every direction now, impossibly close. You belong to us. The words slammed into her, echoing in her skull like a drumbeat, relentless and overpowering. She stumbled, feeling dizzy, but she couldn't stop herself. She was walking toward the figure, her body moving on its own accord, as if the house had already claimed her. When she reached the base of the hill, she looked up again. The figure was still there, but now it seemed closer, the shadows around it thickening. There was a coldness emanating from it that she could feel even from several feet away. The moment she stood still, it began to move. It didn't walk, not in the way that a human would. It glided, a mere wisp of a shape, with a fluidity that made Sarah's skin crawl. She could hear its slow, deliberate steps, but when she tried to look at its face, it was always hidden in the darkness, just beyond her reach. And then it spoke. It's been so long. The voice was faint, almost ethereal, but it was unmistakable. The voice from the box, the voice from the walls. It was the same voice, yet this time, it carried an air of sadness, of longing. It seemed as if it were speaking to her, as much as it was speaking to itself. What do you want from me? Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse. The figure did not respond immediately. It stood there, as if contemplating her words. And, finally, it moved closer, and Sarah took a step back, but she felt a force she couldn't explain pull her forward again. I need you to remember, it whispered. The house needs you to remember. The words hit her like a blow to the chest, and suddenly, memories began to flood her mind, sharp and overwhelming. They weren't her own, though. They were memories that belonged to someone else, a woman with dark eyes, sitting in the very same room Sarah had found the box. The woman had been holding something, but Sarah couldn't see what. The woman had been afraid, but why? The figure moved even closer, its presence suffocating now, the air thick with a suffocating, oppressive weight. Sarah's mind swirled with confusion, trying to understand what was happening. The house, the ashes, the whispers, the figure, it was all connected, but how? Before Sarah could ask another question, the figure's hand shot out and grabbed her by the wrist. The coldness of his touch sent shockwaves through her body, and she screamed, pulling away, but its grip only tightened. You cannot run, it rasped. You are bound to this place, to me. With that, the figure yanked her forward, dragging her toward the house. As though its hold on her was inescapable, Sarah fought to free herself, but it was as though the very ground was pulling her in, resisting her every step. Her feet felt as though they were sinking into the earth. Suddenly, the house loomed before them, its windows dark and empty, its silhouette casting an ominous shadow across the land. The door creaked open on its own, a sound that sent a chill crawling up Sarah's spine. The figure pushed her inside, and she was forced to step over the threshold. The air inside the house was thick with dust, but there was something else, a feeling, a presence that was darker than any memory Sarah had of the place. She stumbled backward, her heart racing in her chest. As she looked around, the walls seemed to be closing in, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, creeping like tendrils that sought to consume her. And then she saw it. The figure in the photograph from the box man with hollow eyes was standing at the top of the staircase. He was waiting for her. The man's eyes locked onto hers, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Welcome home, he said, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. It's time to remember everything. The house seemed to stretch and groan around Sarah as she stood frowning at the bottom of the stairs. Her mind was racing, heart pounding in her chest. The figure of the man from the photograph was now standing motionless at the top of the stairs, his hollow eyes fixed on her. The oppressive air in the house pressed down on her, and the whispers intensified once more. Remember, her fingers shook as she reached out, her mind desperate to piece together what was happening. Everything about this place, this house, this figure felt so familiar, yet so wrong. The man in the photograph was somehow a part of the house, and the house was a part of him. The figures, the memories, the ashes, everything was connected, but she couldn't figure out how. It felt as if she was being suffocated by a past that she couldn't escape, a history that was slowly consuming her. The man's voice echoed in her ears again. "Come to me, Sarah, come and see what you've forgotten." Her body refused to move. She wanted to scream, to run, but the terror was paralyzing. Her legs wouldn't obey. She felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, one wrong step away from falling into a void. And then, with a suddenness that made her heart skip a beat, the figure at the top of the stairs began to move toward her. It wasn't walking out. It was gliding, floating downward, his form distorting and warping with each step. The darkness around him seemed to warp, bending and twisting in unnatural ways. Sarah could hear his footsteps echoing in the silence, a sound like the tapping of nails against wood. "Come closer," the voice echoed in her mind. But Sarah was frowning. "You cannot hide," the figure whispered. "The past is coming for you. The price of memory must be paid." And with that, the house seemed to breathe around her, the shadows thickening until they were all she could see. Her vision blurred, and the world around her began to disintegrate. She was no longer standing in the foyer. The air was colder now, the room darker, the floor beneath her feet now soft and damp. She could hear the sounds of distant cries, muffled by the walls. The walls themselves seemed to be alive, pulsing with an energy that was foreign and ancient. Something was alive here, something that had been waiting for her to return. The whispers were now screaming. It's time for you to remember everything." And Sarah had no choice but to look into the abyss. Sarah's breath was ragged as she stumbled through the thick darkness that seemed to close in around her. Her body ached from the terror, but it wasn't the physical pain that consumed her. It was the growing realization of what the house, the whispers, and the figure truly were. She could feel her mind unraveling, every ounce of her being screaming for escape. Yet there was nowhere to run. The house had become her prison, a maze of shadows and memories that she could not escape. The darkness had swallowed her whole, and now she was nothing but a shadow, lost in a forgotten place that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. There was no warmth, no light, no hope, only the suffocating weight of the past, pressing in on her from all sides. The whispers had grown louder, now like a chorus of voices, all calling to her, all demanding her attention. "Come closer. You belong to us. You have to remember." Sarah's mind was a swirl of confusion and dread, the lines between the present and the past blurring beyond recognition. The figure of man with hollow eyes from the photograph was now right beside her. His presence was cold, like death itself, but it wasn't his physical form that made her heart race. It was the weight of his existence in this place. In her mind, the walls around her seemed to shift and sway, distorting as if they were made of mist. The shadows twisted and writhed like living things, pushing at the edges of her consciousness. "You must remember," the voice rasped in her ear. It was no longer just the man, it was a chorus, an entire mass of voices speaking from all directions, pulling her in with their hypnotic power. Sarah clenched her fists, her knuckles white with the effort. She needed to fight. She needed to break free. "Stop," she gasped, her voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, the room began to change again, the darkness swirling around her like smoke. She felt herself being pulled toward something, toward a memory, toward a truth she had forgotten long ago. Her mind flashed back to the days when she was a child. She saw her mother's face, pale and hollow-eyed, her lips whispering something that Sarah couldn't quite understand. She saw her father, standing in the doorway, staring at her with cold eyes that mirrored the man in the photograph. She saw a fire, but not one of warmth. It was a fire of destruction, a fire that burned everything, a fire that erased something from the world. "You remember now, don't you?" The voice was inside her mind, twisting her thoughts. She saw the old house one she had grown up in. She saw it as it had been before the fire. Her family had lived there, and it had been filled with love and laughter. But now, it was empty, hollow, broken. The fire had taken it all, her parents, her life, and Sarah had never known the truth about why it had happened. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the memories rushed back to her. She saw the faces of the people in the photographer parents, her grandparents, and the strangers that had been part of this cursed history. The same man, standing among them, the same man who had been haunting her, leading her toward this very moment. And then it hit her. The house, the fire, it had all been part of something much darker, something much more sinister than she had ever imagined. The man in the photograph wasn't just some lost soul. He was the key to it all. The man had been the one to set the fire, the one who had torn her family apart. He had done it for one reason, to destroy the memory. Sarah's chest tightened as the truth filled her mind like poison. The fire hadn't been an accident. It had been a ritual, an ancient, cursed ritual meant to erase the truth from existence. And now, all the memories the ones she had so desperately tried to bury were rushing back. The price of memory had always been this. The price had always been her. She gasped as the memories consumed her, flooding her consciousness. She saw herself, as a little girl, staring at the fire as it consumed the house. She remembered the screams from others, her father's, and the laughter of the man in the photograph. The man had been there, standing in the flames, watching it all burn. He had watched them die. The truth had always been buried deep within her mind, hidden by the fire, hidden by the ashes. But now it was coming to the surface, and the weight of it was unbearable. The fire had taken everything from her, and now it was coming back to claim her. The walls of the house seemed to close in around her, the shadows pressing against her, suffocating her. She was drowning in the darkness, in the memories, in the whispers. There was no escape. You must remember, the voices chorused. The price of memory has come due. Sarah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. And then, as if on cue, everything went silent. The whisper stopped, the shadow vanished, the air was still, and Sarah was left standing in the void, her mind shattered, her heart breaking. She had remembered everything: the fire, the man, the house, the cost of memory. She looked around, and suddenly, the figure was gone. The man, the shadows, the voice, he had all disappeared, leaving her standing alone in the silence. The house was empty. The whispers had faded, but they weren't gone. They were still with her, embedded deep in her mind, like a song that she could not hear. Sarah didn't know how long she stood there, staring into the empty space. She didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. The world outside was quiet, the night air still and cold. And then, at the corner of her eye, she saw it, the small pile of ashes, resting on the ground where the fire had once been. It had been there all along, just as it had always been. But this time, the ashes weren't empty. From within the ashes, something moved. Sarah's heart stopped as she stared at the pile. She saw something shift beneath the dust, someone reaching out from the depths. And the whisper returned. You cannot escape. If you like this story, don't forget to hit the like button, share and subscribe the channel. Thanks for watching.